Okay, we just got finished talking about measurement validity, and now we are going to be moving on to talk about internal validity. Basically, what can go wrong with the design. Minimizing the threats for internal validity are design criteria for methods, for your methodology. Internal validity is related to the extent for which the results can be manipulated by a researcher. So whatever the procedures are, whatever the researcher is doing to impact a dependent variable, all of that can be susceptible to the threats to internal validity. And they can be criticized too by readers. We want to make sure that any variance or any change we see in a dependent variable is due to change or variance in the independent variable and not something else unintended. You might hear those unintended variables are things that we want to control for, and we learned about what control variables are. But there are some times that we can't figure out or come up with what all those control variables should be. And those are threats. Those are going to be threats to the internal validity of our study. There are 8 different threats to internal validity that we're going to talk about here. The first one is called selection bias. And I put this one first because I think it's the one that we run into most often. And it can be related to different kinds of design. For instance, selection bias with regard to self-selection. This could be related to having an experimental design. It could be related to surveys. It could be related in any sort of research where you're asking for volunteers to participate. Because in the end, the volunteers are probably in some way different from the folks who do not volunteer. Non-random assignment is related to experiments, and we're going to talk about experiments a little bit later in a different module, but with experiments, you typically will have a research group and a control group. And for a robust method for experiments, you want to have random assignment into each of those groups. If we don't, we cannot account for individual differences. If we can't account for individual differences, we are susceptible to selection bias, that threat to internal validity. Non-response bias is related to surveys. Who answers the survey and who doesn't answer the survey? Probably the people or the individuals who answer the survey are in some way different from those who do not answer the survey. That adds some unintended consequences and some unintended bias to our design. So we want to try to control for these things, and we'll talk about how we can mitigate some of these threats. The second major threat to internal validity is subject effects. And subject effects are people who are in the study. In some way, it's possible that the awareness of being a test subject could in some way bias the results of the study. Also, if subjects who are aware talk with each other, that could bias the study. And finally, attitude of the subjects could bias the study. For instance, in our critical thinking test, let's say we want to measure learning on a critical thinking outcome, and the subjects are taking a test. But the test is optional, and it's not for a grade. It's purely for assessment's sake. Well, if the subjects aren't trying very hard on the test, that could bias your results for the assessment of critical thinking. And so you don't know. It's just a threat. You don't know what their attitude is, and you don't know what the biasness could mean. It's just a threat. And so to try to mitigate something like that, to try to get the students to try their hardest on the test in order to measure their critical thinking skills, you could manipulate the setting, meaning you could make sure that the students or the subjects are going to get a grade, let's say, for their results on the test, or they're going to get extra credit for their results on the test. The third threat to internal validity is mortality. We usually could see this in long-term studies, and other words used for mortality, which is kind of morbid, are things like attrition. What is the attrition rate in the study? So you're looking at a longer-term study, longer duration, and inevitably you're not going to have as many subjects at the end of the study as you do at the beginning of the study. Well, just like subject effects and selection bias, people who drop out of the study are in some way probably different from those who stayed in. And that's a threat to validity. For instance, if we want to have a pretest type data, we can determine whether or not the leavers in our study are different from those who stay. And we study people who drop out of college all the time. And so in order to find out how they're different or what types of things impacted their reasons for dropping out, if you have pre-type tests or pre-measures related to your study for everybody in your study, then you actually know the variables that might contribute to the differences in academic success.
This ends this part of the module's presentation. Please move on to review the next part